The moment I knew everything had changed wasn't dramatic.
There was no argument, no slammed door, no tearful confession. It was a Sunday afternoon in September, and I was standing at my neighbor Frank's backyard fence, talking about nothing in particular, the weather, his new lawnmower, the way the elm trees were already starting to turn. And Frank looked at me with this expression I can only describe as careful. Like he was choosing his words the way you choose your steps on ice. "How are you doing, Gary?" he said. "I mean, really doing." I told him I was fine. "Good, actually. Just got back from a fishing trip up near the Boundary Waters, slept better than I had in years." He nodded slowly. Too slowly. And then he said something that I've turned over in my mind maybe 1,000 times since. "Linda mentioned you've been having some episodes. We just want you to know, if you ever need anything." I kept my face completely still. I've been doing that my whole life, keeping still when everything inside me is moving. 31 years in commercial insurance, you learn to hold your expression like a card hand. I thanked Frank. I said we'd have him and Carol over for dinner soon. I walked back across the lawn, went inside, poured myself a glass of water, and stood at the kitchen sink looking out at the backyard. And I thought, so that's the play. But let me start from the beginning. My name is Gary Callahan. I'm 53 years old. I spent 31 years as a senior claims adjuster and eventually a regional director for a mid-sized commercial insurance firm out of Minneapolis. I'm not a flashy man. I drive a 2019 Ford F-150, I own a modest house in a suburb called Maple Grove, I coach youth baseball in the spring, and I make a pretty good smoked brisket. I am not, by any measure, a man who people would describe as exciting. My daughter Emma calls me steady. She means it as a compliment. I take it as one. I married Linda Callahan Linda Morse before she took my name 24 years ago. We met at a mutual friend's wedding in Duluth. She was a second-grade teacher then. Warm, funny, good with people in a way that I admired because I'd always had to work at it. We had 2 kids, Emma, now 22, finishing her master's in education down in Iowa City, and Marcus, 19, a sophomore at University of Minnesota studying mechanical engineering. Good kids. Serious kids. The kind of kids that make you feel like you did at least one thing right. The marriage had been cooling for a long time. I won't pretend otherwise. These things don't happen overnight, they happen the way a river changes course, slowly, and you only notice when the bank looks different. Linda had stopped teaching about 6 years ago. Said she was burned out, and I believed her. Teaching is hard work, and she'd given it everything. She started doing what she called community work. Volunteering, organizing, joining groups. The book club was one of those things. 12 women who met every other Thursday at someone's house, drank wine, talked about books they'd halfway read, and I now understand talked about other things too. I want to be fair to Linda. For a long time, I think she was genuinely unhappy and didn't know how to say it. I wasn't the easiest man to live with. I worked long hours. I was distracted. There were years when I was more present at the office than I was at the dinner table. I own that. But there's a difference between a marriage that's struggling and a marriage where one person decides to start quietly dismantling the other. That's what Linda did. She started dismantling me. The first signs were small enough that I filed them away and didn't look at them directly. She started referring to things I'd said that I didn't remember saying. You told me we were going to the Hendersons on Saturday. I had no memory of agreeing to that. You already called the plumber about the leak, don't you remember? I didn't remember, because I hadn't done it. Small things. Easily explained. Memory isn't perfect, and I was 51 years old and tired most of the time. I let it go. Then my colleague Dennis pulled me aside at a company lunch last March.
Dennis has been in our St. Paul office for 11 years, solid guy, not prone to gossip.
He said, quietly, that Linda had called his wife Patricia to ask for the name of a neurologist. Said she was worried about Gary. Said she'd noticed some changes. I drove home that night and I sat in the driveway for 20 minutes before I went inside.
I thought about Frank at the fence. I thought about Dennis.
I thought about the way our friends had started looking at me, that same careful expression, like they were waiting for me to forget something.
I thought, how long has this been going on? And why? It took me about 2 weeks to figure out the why. And when I did, everything became very clear.
There's a drawer in our home office, Linda's desk, technically, though I paid for everything in that room, where she kept what she called her household files.
Insurance documents, school records for the kids when they were younger, appliance warranties, that kind of thing. I'd never had a reason to go through it.
I had my own filing system at work.
The house stuff was her domain. I went through it on a Tuesday evening in early October while Linda was at book club. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I was looking for the shape of something I didn't yet understand. What I found was a folder labeled Medical Gary that I had never seen before. Inside it were printed articles about early onset dementia. Printed pages from websites about how to talk to a loved one about memory concerns. A handwritten list, Linda's handwriting, neat and looping, of incidents. Dates and descriptions. October 3rd, forgot dinner with Hartmann's. Said he'd never agreed to it. October 9th, couldn't find his keys, accused me of moving them. October 14th, repeated himself twice in same conversation about baseball. I stood there holding that list for a long time. Then I found the second folder. It was labeled Financial Planning and tucked behind a folder of old tax returns. Inside was a printout of information about guardianship laws in Minnesota. Another printout about what happens to marital assets when one spouse is deemed mentally incapacitated. There were handwritten notes about a name, Robert Vance, and a phone number with a 952 area code. I put everything back exactly as I found it. I took photographs of every page with my phone. I closed the drawer. I went to the kitchen and made myself a grilled cheese sandwich and watched the news until Linda came home. When she walked in, she was bright-eyed and cheerful the way she always was after book club. She asked how my evening was. I told her it was quiet. I asked about the book they were discussing. She told me something about it. I nodded and said it sounded interesting. I did not sleep that night. But not because I was upset. I didn't sleep because I was thinking. I'm good at thinking. It's what I've done my whole career: take a complex situation, map the variables, identify the exposure, build a response. I've handled claims involving fraud, arson, wrongful death suits, corporate malfeasance. I know how people behave when they think they're smarter than the room. Linda had been building a narrative. She was laying groundwork with friends, possibly with my colleagues, maybe with a doctor, to establish that I was cognitively declining. If she could get that established, or even strongly suggested, it would change everything in a divorce. Asset division. Control of finances. Possibly guardianship. Robert Vance, I found out the next morning, was a family law attorney. Specifically, one with a noted specialty in cases involving incapacitated spouses. She had already hired a lawyer. She just hadn't told me yet. I made an appointment with my own attorney the following Monday. His name was David Cho. 48 years old, Harvard Law, 14 years in family law in the Minneapolis area. A colleague at work had used him in a difficult divorce 3 years prior and described him as surgically precise. That's what I needed. Not aggressive. Not theatrical. Precise. I sat in his office on a Monday morning and laid out everything I'd found. The folder. The list. The guardianship research. The photographs on my phone. David looked at them carefully, asked a few questions, and then leaned back in his chair and said, "Mr. Callahan, she's not the first person to try this approach. But she's made some significant mistakes." The first mistake was documentation. She'd written things down, which meant I had evidence of her intent. The second mistake was timing, she hadn't yet filed, which meant I could move first. The third mistake, David said, was underestimating what a competency evaluation would actually show. We started building. The first thing David recommended was a full neuropsychological evaluation with a respected independent specialist. I scheduled it within 2 weeks. 3 hours of testing memory, executive function, processing speed, language, spatial reasoning. The psychologist was a Dr. Patricia Osei, out of the University of Minnesota Medical Center. Calm, thorough, professional. At the end of it, she told me I'd scored in the high normal to superior range across all categories and that she found no evidence whatsoever of cognitive impairment. That report went into a folder. The second thing I did was begin systematically documenting my own daily life. Nothing dramatic, I just started keeping a simple log on my phone. Date, time, what I did, who I spoke to, brief notes. Not because I was paranoid, but because if someone was going to claim I was losing my mind, I was going to have a quiet, boring, consistent record that said otherwise. Weeks of it. Months of it. Every baseball practice I ran, every work meeting I led, every conversation I had with Emma or Marcus. The third thing I did was talk to Frank. Not to confront him, not even close to that. I went over one Saturday morning with a 6-pack of Grain Belt and I sat on his porch and I said, casually, that I'd been hearing from a few people that Linda had been expressing concerns about my health, and that I wanted him to know that I'd just gotten a clean bill of cognitive health from a specialist at the U, and I'd be happy to share the documentation if he was ever curious. Frank looked at his beer bottle for a long moment and then he said, "Gary, I think we may have gotten a skewed picture of things." I told him I appreciated that. We talked about the Vikings for an hour. I went home. Within a week, I'd had similar conversations with Dennis and his wife, with 2 other couples in our social circle, and with our neighbors the Bergmans. Not accusations. Not dramatic revelations. Just calm, documented, factual corrections. I didn't say Linda was lying. I just made sure the people she'd been talking to knew the truth. The fourth thing I did was get a full financial audit done. I hired a forensic accountant, a woman named Sheila Rand, recommended by David Cho, to go through every account, every asset, every transaction over the past 3 years. I had a right to all of it. It was all marital property. Linda didn't know Sheila existed. Sheila found things. Over 22 months, Linda had moved a total of $47,000 from our joint savings account into a personal account I hadn't known about, opened at a different bank, in her name only. The transfers were small, irregular, carefully timed. $60 here, $200 there, occasionally a few thousand when we'd had a large deposit. It had the signature of something planned. Something patient. That report also went into a folder. By the time Linda filed for divorce in late November, I found out when David called me on a Tuesday afternoon to tell me the papers had been received. I had been prepared for 6 weeks. David filed our response within 48 hours. The Robert Vance strategy, as David explained it to me, was built on a foundation. The foundation was the cognitive narrative, the story Linda had been telling people, and presumably was planning to tell a court, about her poor declining husband who needed someone to look after his affairs. Without that foundation, the rest of the strategy collapsed. She'd lose the guardianship angle. She'd lose the sympathetic framing.
She'd be left with a straightforward marital dissolution, and in a straightforward marital dissolution, the $47,000 in hidden transfers becomes a very significant problem.
The cognitive evaluation from Dr. Osei was the first thing David submitted.
3 pages of professional assessment concluding that I was cognitively intact, followed by my 6-week daily log showing a man who coached baseball, ran a regional office, handled complex claims, maintained active relationships with his adult children, and remembered everything he was supposed to remember.
Robert Vance asked for time to review.
2 weeks later, his office reached out to David with an initial settlement proposal. It was not generous, but the tone of it had changed. The guardianship language was gone. There was no mention of cognitive concerns. It was, as David put it, a retreat to defensible ground.
But the real turn, came from an unexpected direction.
Emma called me on a Thursday evening in December, about 3 weeks after Linda had filed. She was home from Iowa City for the weekend, staying with a friend rather than at the house, which told me she was already navigating carefully. She asked if we could meet for coffee, just the two of us, at the Caribou on Main Street. We sat across from each other over large dark roasts, and Emma said, quietly, that she needed to tell me something. She said that over the past several months, her mother had been calling her regularly, more regularly than usual, and that many of those calls had involved detailed accounts of my episodes.
Forgotten conversations. Confused behavior. Things Linda claimed I'd said and then denied.
Emma said she'd been worried. She said she'd believed it, mostly, because her mother had always been the one who talked and her father had always been the one who was quiet.
But Emma is a smart young woman.
She's going to be a school psychologist. She started noticing patterns in the stories. They were always things that couldn't be verified, always things that position Linda as the concerned caretaker and me as the confused subject. And when Emma came home for Thanksgiving, she said, she watched me for 2 days. She watched how I talked, how I moved through the house, how I remembered things, how I interacted with Marcus and with her. Dad, she said, holding her coffee cup with both hands, there's nothing wrong with you.
I told her I knew that.
She said, I told Mom that. I told her what I observed. I told her I didn't think what she was describing matched what I was seeing.
I asked her what Linda said. Emma looked out the window for a moment. She told me I wasn't seeing the full picture. That I was in denial because I didn't want to believe it. Then Emma reached into her bag and set her phone on the table between us. She had recordings. 3 of them.
Her mother, on the phone, describing my supposed episodes in detail, and in 2 of the recordings, contradicting herself about the specifics.
Same incident, different details. A different date. A different room of the house.
The kind of inconsistency that, when you're building a false narrative, you don't always catch.
Emma had saved them because something hadn't felt right.
She hadn't known what she was going to do with them.
She just saved them. I sat very still for a moment.
Then I told Emma that I was proud of her, and that I loved her, and that I was going to take good care of this situation. I called David Cho from the parking lot.
Robert Vance withdrew from the case in January.
I don't know exactly what conversation passed between him and Linda, but David told me the withdrawal was framed as a conflict of interest discovered upon further review. What that means, in plain terms, is that a good attorney recognized a losing case and protected himself from it. Linda's second attorney was a younger man, less experienced, which told me she'd had to go further down the referral chain than she'd expected. His name was Erickson. He was perfectly competent, but he was working with diminished material. The $47,000 in transferred funds was central.
In Minnesota, dissipation of marital assets is treated seriously. Sheila Rand's forensic report was methodical and detailed and showed the pattern of transfers with complete clarity.
Linda's explanation, offered through Erickson,
was that she'd been setting aside money for household emergencies and hadn't thought to mention it. David let that explanation sit on the table for a moment before he walked through the dates, the amounts, and the timing, including several transfers that had occurred within days of her meeting with Robert Vance. The cognitive narrative was not raised again. Not once. What happened in mediation, which took place over 2 sessions in February, was not dramatic. There was no courtroom confrontation, no theatrical moment of revelation. It was a conference room, 2 attorneys, a mediator, and 2 people dividing 24 years. Linda sat across the table from me and I looked at her the way I look at a complex claim, with attention, without emotion. She looked tired. The confidence I'd watched her carry through the fall, that particular brightness she had when she thought she was winning, was gone. The settlement reflected the asset transfers. The marital home, which I had paid the mortgage on for 17 years, was sold, and the proceeds were divided, but Linda's share was reduced to account for the dissipated funds plus interest. The retirement accounts, accumulated over my 3 decades of work, were divided according to the standard formula, but the forensic report gave us leverage we wouldn't have had otherwise. Linda's personal account, the one she'd been quietly filling for nearly 2 years, was identified and factored in. She had expected to walk away with a sympathetic narrative and a controlled outcome. She walked away with what the math said she deserved, and not $1 more. The house sold in April. A young family from Edina bought it, 2 kids, a golden retriever, a bike in the driveway. I stood in the front yard on closing day for a few minutes, just looking at it. 24 years. I didn't feel much, which surprised me. Or maybe it didn't. Marcus helped me move my things into my apartment in March. He didn't say a lot, he's a quiet kid, takes after me, but at one point, while we were carrying a bookshelf up a flight of stairs, he said, "Dad, I just want you to know. I always knew you were fine." I told him I knew he did. We got the bookshelf through the door on the 2nd try. Linda moved into a rental in Plymouth. I know this because Emma told me. I don't drive past it. I don't need to. The last legal matter was resolved on a Thursday afternoon in May, in a courtroom in Hennepin County. It wasn't a trial, trials are rare in divorce proceedings. It was a brief hearing to formalize the settlement and enter the final decree. The judge was a woman named Honorable Diane Morrow, calm and efficient, the kind of judge who has seen everything and is moved by none of it. David and I sat at our table. Erickson and Linda sat at theirs. The judge reviewed the settlement terms, asked several procedural questions, noted the forensic accounting findings and their incorporation into the asset division, and signed the decree. It took about 25 minutes. Linda and I did not speak in the hallway. There was nothing to say. I had stopped being angry a long time ago, somewhere around the time I found Dr. Rose's evaluation sitting in a folder on my desk, clean and thorough and complete, and understood that the story Linda had tried to write about me had no ending that worked in her favor. I walked out of the courthouse and into a bright May afternoon in downtown Minneapolis. David shook my hand on the steps and said, "Well done, Gary." I thanked him. I walked to my truck, which I'd parked in a ramp on 3rd Street. I sat in it for a moment with the windows down, listening to the city. Then I drove north. I live now in a 2-bedroom apartment in St. Anthony, about 15 minutes from downtown Minneapolis and about 10 minutes from where Marcus goes to school. It's quieter than I expected. I have a small balcony where I drink my coffee in the morning and watch the light come up over the rooftops. The job is the same. Same office, same colleagues, same work that I've always been good at. Dennis came by my office about 2 weeks after the decree was finalized and put a bottle of scotch on my desk without saying anything. I thanked him. We had a glass each at 5 o'clock. That was enough. Emma drove up from Iowa City in June. We spent a weekend at a cabin near Brainerd that a colleague lent me, canoes, a wood stove,
walleye that I actually managed to catch and cook without embarrassing myself. Emma sat across from me at the little table by the window and said, "You seem different, Dad."
I asked her what she meant.
She thought about it for a moment. "Lighter," she said. I think she's right. There's something that happens when you carry a weight for a long time and then you set it down, not the weight of a marriage exactly, but the weight of being seen wrong. Of being quietly misrepresented to the people around you, of having the ground under your identity slowly shifted. When that stops, when the record is corrected and the facts are on the table and the whole careful construction someone built against you simply fails, there's a lightness to it.
Not triumph. Just air. I coach baseball again this spring.
Same league, same kids, different faces, but the same basic chaos of 10-year-olds learning to throw and catch and run the bases without causing someone an injury.
I like it. I like the simplicity of it.
A ball, a bat, a field, and a set of rules that mean exactly what they say.
Frank and Carol came over for dinner last month.
We grilled steaks on my small balcony grill, not ideal, but it worked. Frank told me, quietly, over dishes, that he was sorry for the part he'd played in things. I told him he hadn't played much of a part. He'd believed what he'd been told by someone he trusted. That's not a failing.
I don't hold it against him. I'm not angry at Linda. I want to be clear about that.
Whatever she thought she was doing, whether it was desperation, or bad advice, or something she'd been planning for longer than I knew, it doesn't occupy much space in me anymore.
People do what they do. What matters is whether you respond to it with your head or your chest. I responded with my head.
I have my files, my apartment, my kids, my routine. I have a fishing trip planned for August back up near the Boundary Waters, same lake I went to the year before, same outfitter, same route. I'll sit in a canoe for 3 days and think about nothing more complicated than where the walleye are running.
That's enough. That's more than enough.